to another episode of In Focus brought to you by the Uongozi Institute. I'm your host, Gwamaka Kifugwe. On tonight's program, we're looking at urbanization in Africa, the opportunities, the challenges, the causes of urbanization. And with us in studio to understand what's going on, what are the pitfalls, and where we really need to concentrate, we're joined by Professor Ivan Turok. Professor Ivan Turok is an executive director at the Human Sciences Research Council. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Regional Studies Journal and the chairman of the Durban City Planning Commission. Professor Turok, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much.
So are there factors that are different about urbanization in Africa compared to the rest of the world, like Asia, South America, and so on, but also historically compared to North America and Europe? You know, what is specific to Africa?
There are dangers in generalizing, but I think on the whole, conditions are rather different. And part of it is that the economy of Africa, at least until fairly recently, has not been doing as well as in Asia or in Latin America. And so there haven't been the growth in jobs and other opportunities in the cities that there have been, particularly in Asia. So urbanization has partly been more induced by poverty and pressure in rural areas and less pulled by the opportunities available. As I say, that's quite a generalization, and there are undoubtedly cities in Africa where the economy is now growing strongly and where there is a real opportunity to transform living conditions for the majority of the people, if we can get it right. So the opportunities are there in many countries, but we need to, they won't come automatically. Urbanization will not automatically and naturally translate into improvements in living conditions. We need governments and other actors, other stakeholders to really harness the opportunities that urbanization presents itself, to realize those in terms of prosperity.
What is actually driving urbanization in Africa?
Well, Africa's a big place, so we have to be a bit careful about generalizing for the whole continent. But on the whole, it tends to be more push factors than pull factors. So there are problems in the countryside, there are problems of the environment, climate change, there are problems of famine, which are a big push factor. There are problems of conflict. In many countries we have civil wars and a legacy of civil wars. So poverty and destitution in many cases is forcing people out of rural areas to seek opportunities in the cities.
And from the pull side of it, what do cities offer that maybe other rural communities might not be able to give these people who are looking for opportunity?
I think we should distinguish between the reality and the perception. And so the perception is that there are much better opportunities in the cities. Economic opportunities, jobs and incomes and livelihoods. Also the bright lights that somehow life is better in the city. There is more active social life. There are more opportunities to engage with other people, to interact and to meet and mingle with people from different walks of life. The reality is often that these opportunities are highly sought after. Jobs are scarce in most African cities, and so the streets are not paved with gold. Life is tough. People are forced to compete and to battle against each other to get whatever economic opportunities are available. So it's not a wonderful situation in many cases, and it's not an answer to all ills. Just moving to the city is not suddenly going to transform people's lives as they may hope.
In your opinion, what are the key challenges that key decision makers, urban planners, managers, decision makers really need to be aware of and that need to sort of keep in mind as they go forward?
It's critically important that we think long term on this issue, that we are not just responding to problems and crises as they emerge, that we recognize that urbanization is here to stay, that it's going to continue at a significant rate, and that we make plans accordingly. Because otherwise I think we are going to be swamped by the problem and overwhelmed by the problem. Indeed, we see that in a number of cities, that we are overwhelmed by the scale of urbanization and really struggling to cope with it. So we do have to think long term and make plans accordingly. And that means really gearing up to this issue, taking urbanization much more seriously. Urbanization is a tremendous opportunity to transform our societies and our economies if we take it seriously. If we regard it as just another factor, another issue facing Africa, then I do fear that we will not capture the possibilities, and in fact we will end up being overwhelmed by massive urbanization of poverty and end up with very large and unmanageable informal settlements or slums in which social conditions are terrible, in which environmental conditions are frightful, in which health issues, outbreaks of disease, Ebola, HIV, AIDS, cholera, could be really, it's a very worrying prospect that if we don't take urbanization more seriously.
Sure. And, I mean, naturally with urbanization, the discussion tends to focus on urban areas, but surely there's also an impact on rural communities. If they're being drained of particularly young people, talented people, moving into cities and seeking opportunities, what are the impacts we can expect to see on the rural side of this relationship?
Most of Africa, the rural populations are growing. It's not a question of people moving and denuding rural areas of population. So there is a big challenge, a massive challenge in rural areas as well. So this is not an agenda of either or. Focus on the cities at the expense of the countryside. We're not saying that at all. We're saying that we need to develop both. We need to strengthen urban-rural linkages so that the rural areas also prosper alongside the cities. We need to strengthen the connectivity between places so that farmers in rural areas have markets, can exploit the markets in the cities for their produce, so that people can move between town and city, countryside and city effectively. But we also need to recognize that different places have different economic potentials. The countryside has opportunities in agriculture, in tourism, in renewable energy, in mining and minerals. There are many opportunities for the countryside, and we need also, government needs a rural policy which will harness the opportunities and the energy of rural communities to develop those opportunities so that not everybody is forced to leave the countryside and move to the city. So that's quite a tall order for government to have a sophisticated spatial policy that recognizes the potential and the future of the cities, but doesn't neglect the countryside.
To put it quite bluntly, can African cities compete, not just with each other, but with cities and countries really around the world? What advantages do we have, again to generalize, in Africa that our cities can really take advantage of? And what would it take to do it?
Right. Well, these are very, very important questions. And I think one important advantage we have now that we didn't have maybe 10 or 15 years ago is natural resources. So the discovery in many African countries of oil and gas and all sorts of minerals creates a source of revenue that offers tremendous potential if we invest that the surplus from these resources effectively and carefully. So if we invest in urban infrastructure, in creating cities that work reasonably well, that gives us a big opportunity. Because actually when you talk to the private sector, they are interested in Africa. They're interested in Africa because of the growing population. Right? This represents a tremendous market, a consumer market for all the products that companies in Europe, in America and Asia are looking for. They're looking for new markets, and Africa over the next 50 years will be the fastest growing population in the world. Right? So when markets are static in Europe, we have a continuing stagnant position there. When North America is struggling to recover from the recession, the private sector, business, big business, is looking to Africa as a source of future growth. So we can harness that interest if our cities are more functional, if our cities have an energy. We haven't talked very much about energy and power, right? That's a major constraint. Nigeria has 10% of the energy generating capacity of South Africa, with a much bigger population and now a bigger economy. right? It's amazing how it does that, how it's done that. So some of these are some sort of fairly basic issues, actually, around infrastructure investment. The other thing, the advantage that many African cities have is a port location. Because in a more global economy, with exporting of resources and importing of processed products, having good communications is critical. So we need to ensure that our ports are functional, that the port systems are not too inefficient, that ships have to wait for 20 days before they can offload or load their stock. And we need our ports to be connected into the interior of these countries. So both landlocked countries and landlocked regions can access ports. So that means good railways and good road systems where trucks and containers can travel reasonably efficiently. We need our borders to be less bureaucratic. Many border controls in Africa, and that's a real problem for landlocked countries, right? Trucks have to wait 5, 6, 7 days at the border to get the permits to get through. That's tremendous inefficiency. These things are relatively simple to fix. You know, if we've got a vision of a more integrated market across Africa, where we're a single economic entity, we need to move much more rapidly in that direction. I think cities have a critical role to play as nodes of trade, of foreign investment within Africa. Again, that requires a sort of economic vision for cities, which is that they are critical to strengthening the whole economy. And this is where economic growth will be driven from. And it's a positive vision for cities, which is beginning to emerge from the Economic Commission for Africa, from the African Union. This kind of positive economic role is gradually and belatedly being recognized as really important for the future of the continent.
Where do you see the key challenges? Again, to generalize, but in Africa, where do you see the key challenges in that strengthening?
I think the key infrastructure investment is one of the key challenges, that we need to find ways of funding investment in basic infrastructure and services: water, sanitation, roads, public transport, electricity. This is a sort of precondition for anything else. If your city doesn't have basic infrastructure, it's never going to function well. All right? So cities need the responsibilities and the powers to address these infrastructure issues. And in some cases that means national government handing over responsibility to cities, along with the resources or with the means of raising the resources through bonds, through borrowing from markets. They've got a source of revenue through ratepayers, so they should be able to borrow money if the government can't fund this infrastructure fully through transfer payments. So that's a precondition. I think some capacity to plan is also really important. Some capacity to think long term, given the scale of the growth. I mean, Dar es Salaam is going to grow, I understand, 3 times in the next 20 years or so. So it needs to recognize that this is accommodating that scale of growth. And that means, you know, having the vision, having the plans, the spatial plans, thinking ahead what that means to triple the population of the city over a relatively short space of time. Strategic thinking skills is the essence of it. I think a third thing that's required is new relationships with communities, so that this is not just government doing it for people. It's government working hand in hand with communities, because there are limited resources, there's no doubt about that. There's limited capacity to change things from government, so we need to have a new style of planning, kind of co-production, working with communities to plan ahead, to improve conditions on the ground. And that's through a different skill set, actually, from traditional local government, which is doing things for communities. It's actually working in partnership with the community, empowering the community, encouraging the community to get on and do things. The community has great skills, great capabilities, but needs support, needs encouragement, needs the legitimacy to get ahead and improve housing and basic services. So new skill sets of working with communities rather than doing things to communities.
And again, in terms of the planning side of it, I mean, this looks like a lot of pressure on governments, on decision makers, and particularly on politicians. What about the other kinds of, how should I say, interest groups? What about the private sector? What about your civil society organizations? What roles can they play in making sure urbanization, again, tends towards the positive and mitigates, or at least, or tries to overcome the negative?
I think all stakeholders have a big role to play. The government has a leadership role, and in particular it's important to strengthen city governments, because governments at national level are not really close enough to the ground to understand and to respond effectively to these pressures and opportunities of urbanization. So we need to empower city governments really to understand our cities and to plan and manage these places better. But of course they can't do that on their own, so they do need to work in partnership with NGOs, civic organization, and of course the private sector. So we need to build a much greater shared understanding. We need these other stakeholders to come to the city, to come to government and say, we need to talk, we need to resolve our challenges. They need to put pressure on government to say that, you know, the city's not working well in this respect, and to come forward with positive ideas. So all interest groups, all stakeholders in society have a responsibility to make our cities work. And they can't just sit back and pursue their own narrow agendas. Cities are by definition places that depend on cooperation between different interests. Otherwise they collapse and they end up in conflict. So it's critically important that I think that all parts of civil society recognize they have a role to play and are positive and proactive about pursuing that broader interest, the shared interest of the city on which we all depend.
And what about the urbanization challenges when it comes to, you know, secondary and tertiary cities, you know, non-mega cities like Dar es Salaam and Johannesburg that are the financial and economic centers? But what about the growth of these other towns and urban areas? What are the prospects for them, and how can they be considered in this?
That is very, very important and quite difficult to anticipate and plan where people should move to. The Chinese have done that quite effectively with a very rigid permit system which restricts where people can go and work. I'm not sure we have the governance capacity to enforce that, implement that in Africa. And I'm not sure it's desirable for moral reasons, but what we can do is to take our secondary cities more seriously, so that if we do not put all our eggs in one basket of the major capital cities, the biggest, the primary cities in our countries, if we also recognize the vital role of secondary cities, then I think same sorts of things, preparing the ground, ensuring that there is land available for people to settle with infrastructure, that people can at the outset perhaps build their own houses, try and get the housing market and the construction industry going in these places so that builders are creating low-cost, affordable housing, but formal housing and multi-story, so creating decent living environments, and also thinking about the economy of these places. It's vital to have jobs and livelihoods for people. You can't just build neighbourhoods and expect people to go there. There need to be jobs for people to go to. So we need we need to align the economic strategy of governments with the spatial, the urban strategy, so that, again, not all the economy is concentrated in one city, but that it has multiple nodes, the economy, that the potential of secondary cities is developed, that we work hard to think about what kinds of industries are appropriate for secondary cities to create an economic base that will generate jobs and taxes to pay for the infrastructure and the services that these cities require. So we've got to think in our industrial policies much more spatially about what's an appropriate economic function for different cities, and how can government catalyze and stimulate the economy in these different cities so that there are jobs for people to go to.
And it's just a kind of final question. Is urbanization in Africa inevitable, or can we grow differently, using a different model than the world has seen?
And that's an interesting question, and I think one sort of quick response is that actually there are no regions in the world that have prospered without developing their cities. If you look back in history, there are no regions or countries globally that have succeeded purely by rural development. So I think that's a critical lesson that we need to learn, that the economic advantages of urbanization, essentially of concentrating resources and people and firms in one place. There are tremendous economic advantages from doing that. Often we see the negative effects, right? As we've talked, we see the congestion, we see the conflict, we see the crime. This is in our face all the time, these negative consequences. We're not as apparent of the tremendous underlying economic advantages of concentrating people and resources in one place. These things are sort of imperceptible, but over the long term they have transformative effects on economic growth. And if you look at all the correlations between economic prosperity and urbanization, you see very, very strong statistical relationships, that urbanization is a key component, it seems, of economic prosperity. Precisely how that works out, we're still actually researching these questions. Why is it that urbanization is so important and so intimately connected to economic development? We're still trying to understand that, but the sheer fact of the situation is that there is a strong statistical relationship suggesting that it's very hard to develop without building cities.
As is our norm on the program, is there any kind of final thought you'd like to share with our audience? Just reflecting on urbanization and why you find it such an interesting and important area.
I mean, I think it's urbanization is fascinating because it touches so many different aspects of our lives. We've talked a lot about the economy. We've talked about social aspects, the tolerance, the creativity that comes in cities when people from different backgrounds mix and mingle ideas, new technologies, new cultures, they're places of ferment, intellectual ferment. If you look back in history at how art and culture and literature and music these days happens in cities, and it stems from the mixing of different cultures and different ethnicities, and so it's a very, very productive process, urbanization, bringing people from different backgrounds together. And I think we don't often recognize that enough. And this is, so, urbanization can be a really positive thing for societies. And if we recognize all the different elements that come together and that create the conditions for success, rather than focusing on the negative. Too much of the discourse in Africa is around the negative effects of urbanization. And so we've got to shift I think we've got to shift the language, we've got to shift the mindset to recognizing the positives that are associated with people moving to cities.
Thank you very much for joining us on the program and for sharing your thoughts and opinions about this area.
Thanks very much.
And thank you at home for watching as well, and we hope you found it interesting and informative. Join us again soon. Goodbye.